There is a sense in the world. There's a sense among believers, there's a sense among unbelievers, there's a sense among all peoples that things are unhinged. The Middle East is unhinged with uprisings, revolutions, and where's this heading?
How are followers of Jesus to relate to all of these things? How do they relate to biblical prophecy?
America is in spiritual, moral crisis. Values are changing, and so rapidly, I mean, that have not happened in the history of man.
How are level-headed, responsible Christians to relate to the testimony of the biblical prophets and the unfolding of chaos throughout the world?
Not just believers are wondering, is this a sign of the end?
When we look at the early church, we see it right in the center of their life was the understanding of the coming of the Lord Jesus, that apocalyptic nature of the church, whether it be in their preaching, whether it be in their prayers, even their pastoral counsel, that the church would be holy and blameless until the day of His appearing. Their cry would be, "Come, Lord Jesus," Maranatha. And so it was right in the heart of the community.
The entire gospel is rooted in prophetic testimony, the prophetic scriptures, whether it's the first coming or the second coming.
One would be hard-pressed to make the case that the second coming is not important in the New Testament. It's clearly the central hope of the church and the Gospels and the epistles throughout the New Testament. But the question of prophecy, eschatology, signs of the times, that's another issue.
Some people in the church, they don't want to have anything to do with kind of the predictive type of prophecy of what's going on with Israel, what's going on with the nations, does the Bible talk about this? And I think that that's a mistake. Peter says we would do well to pay attention to the prophets.
Matthew chapter 24, particularly verse 32 and 33, Jesus actually commanded the people in that generation that He returns in, He commanded them to know they're in the generation. And He said, the way you will know is that all of these signs will be happening. Now, there's only one generation where all of the signs are happening on a global level together. They're happening globally and they're happening simultaneously all together. Only one generation.
We've lost the crucial matter, which is urgency. How should we then live in light of the coming of the Lord? And the church has lost its heart and soul in that way.
We have, the preachers and teachers and theologians and pastors today, they'll emphasize what Jesus did at the cross and major on that, which is good, and then they'll jump to the very end and miss everything in between. And I think this is an unfaithful representation of the story that has been entrusted to us by the prophets and the apostles.
We've not connected holiness to the coming of the Lord. We've not connected lifestyle to the coming of the Lord. We've not connected mission to the coming of the Lord. And the New Testament connects all of those things to the day of the Lord.
Is prophecy valuable? If it's not, why is Jesus teaching His disciples this as His last address to them before the cross? Why is this issue of the end of the age and His return, why did He want to lodge that in their mind as central before He hung between heaven and earth and bled?
We've got to capture that back. We've lost engagement because of it. We've lost holiness because of it. We've lost prayer because of it. We have this basic fog that's resting on the church of confusion about many things that I think eschatology would plumb line us back.
So if it's normative practice, if it's normative Christian practice, if it's even commanded by Jesus to study the signs of the times, then what are the signs that we should be looking to? What are the primary texts that we should be studying right now? And what's coming next? I'm Joel Richardson, and to answer these questions, I sat down with leaders, theologians, pastors, missionaries across the globe. Not only those in the West, but those in the Middle East, in the heart of the biblical world, and North Africa. I sat down and I asked these leaders, What are the primary signs that are being fulfilled in the earth today that would indicate that we're approaching the return of Jesus? Across the boards, the first sign that everyone pointed to as an indicator that we are indeed approaching the end of this age and the return of Jesus is the modern miracle of the rebirth of the state of Israel.
One of the things that's going on now in our time, a few of them, which are kind of like the crosshairs getting more focused. I'd say one of the big things is the return of the Jewish people to their land. That's probably the biggest sign in the past 200 or 300 years of what the Lord is doing.
Well, years ago when I first came to Israel, I was in Jerusalem. I saw all these nations that had come back from the ends of the earth. And as I read the scriptures like Isaiah 11 and other places, he said, I will bring them back a second time, and I'll bring them from the north, the south, the east, and the west. And as I stood there in Jerusalem and read the scriptures that his feet will be on the Mount of Olives, I realized I was standing in a prophetic moment that had never happened before. And to me, one of the great signs of the coming, the return of the Messiah, is the ingathering of the Jewish people who are going to turn to him.
The re-establishing of the state of Israel in 1948. I mean, you can't mistake that. 2,000 years plus, 2,500 years ago, it was prophesied.
Israel's return to the land and her establishment as a state set the context for the fulfillment of the prophets in a way that is unprecedented in history, particularly for the last 1,900 years.
But despite the powerful reality of this modern miracle of the rebirth of the state of Israel, many in the church today deny this to be any miracle at all because they hold on to what is called replacement theology.
There's a division in the house, unfortunately, which is called replacement theology, in which the promises made to Israel from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and David, and the New Covenant particularly, are said to be given over to the church because Israel failed. But yet you have statement after statement in which God says, look, some of the Jewish people may not participate in that final day because of unbelief, but I will not give up the promises.
Now, the New Testament, the apostles did not abrogate, modify, change, annul, or empty those promises of their substance and power, but they affirmed them, they repeated them, they reiterated them.
After all, wasn't it true in Genesis 15? It was God himself who walked between the pieces. They cut a covenant. The word to make a covenant is to cut a covenant. And they cut the pieces, one half the animal on one side, one half the other, forming an aisle down the middle. So there were 3 cut animals and then 2 birds. And God walked between the pieces and said, in effect, may I, God, die like these animals if I don't keep what I promised here.
So the reestablishment of the state of Israel is clear, visible proof that the Lord continues to be faithful to his promises. In fact, so clearly prophesied, so clearly declared was the issue of the reestablishment of Israel at the end of the age, that far before it ever took place, many faithful expositors of the Bible were confidently declaring its future reality.
One of the, I think, glories of church history are these guys like David Barron, and there's others. There's several scholars that in the late 1800s, early 1900s were proclaiming that Israel would actually become a nation, the rebirth of the state of Israel, against all odds. We're talking 1900 years after they've been scattered to the nations.
Many great historic preachers and theologians anticipated this, like Charles Spurgeon, Adolf Saphir, David Barron, J.C. Ryle, Horatius Bonar, great preachers, missionaries, and theologians.
There were guys saying this 50 and 100 and 200 years out.
And even beyond these several theologians from the 1800s, as far back as the 9th century, Ishodad of Merv, a Christian bishop who lived beside the Sea of Galilee, also predicted that Israel would once again become a nation and be repatriated by the Jewish people in the last days. He predicted this well over 1,000 years before it came to pass. So while many theologians have recognized the clear plan of God in the Scriptures to bring the Jewish people back into the land in the last days, many others, still blinded by their embrace of replacement theology or supersessionism, refuse to acknowledge this glaring reality of the fulfillment of biblical prophecy right in front of us.
So when the church then brought in replacement theology and had a supersessionist kind of thing in which they sat now in the chair that belonged to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and his descendants, they took away what God had promised, I will do on the pledge of my life, on the pledge of my life. So I think God is going to fulfill that. And look, it's too late to argue about that because there are already 6 million Jewish people back in the land. So if you're going to argue, you've got to raise 6 million people that are back in the land, which you can't do. So it's about time to shape up the theology in connection with the reality shows.
And so we've got to pay attention to this. This is one of the Lord's great thunderclaps. It's almost as if he himself is prophesying to the nations and saying, I have not abandoned my covenant with this people or with this land, so pay heed to it.
I've been involved in the Temple Mount for over 25 years. When I began going up to the Temple Mount, I would say with my 2 hands, I would be able to count the amount of religious Jews who were going up to the Temple Mount. Today, we have over 300 rabbis who support our activity. We have over 10,000 Jews who go up to the Temple Mount annually. And the topic is on the table. It's on the headlines daily. More and more people are involved. We just had the chairman of the Knesset supporting our activity. In the past, it would seem that most of the people supporting the rebuilding of the temple, supporting the activities toward the rebuilding of the temple, were only radical Jews and radical Christians. Today, the mainstream of religious Jewry in Israel, the modern religious Jewry, it had come down in polls in the Haaretz newspaper, in the Makor Rishon newspaper. We've seen over 70% of the Israeli modern religious community support the rebuilding of the temple. We've seen over 50% of the entire Jewish community in Israel, religious and non-religious, traditional. And we see that the people really, that faith of rebuilding the temple.
But while it is one thing for the Jewish people to have a growing interest in the rebuilding of the Jewish temple, what is even more interesting is a small but growing trend among some Muslims who also wish to see the Jewish temple rebuilt. While in Istanbul, I appeared as a guest with the controversial Muslim leader Adnan Oktar on his live television program. For several years, Oktar has been calling for Jews, Christians, and Muslims to join together to rebuild the Jewish temple. I asked Mr. Oktar about his position.
Tüm güzelliğiyle, bütün ihtişamıyla hem Hristiyanlara, hem Musevilere, hem Müslümanlara hizmet edecek şekilde yeniden o tarihi atmosfer içerisinde kurulacağına inanıyoruz. Bugünlerde de inşallah bunun için yoğun bir gayret göstereceğiz. Güzel bir sembol olarak da mescidin inşasını istiyoruz. Bir mescit yıkıldıysa yeniden yapılmasından doğal bir şey olmaz Müslüman. Bunu mutlaka istemekle mükelleftir.
Another Orthodox Jewish group in Jerusalem called God's Holy Mountain Project has a very similar vision. A painting commissioned by this organization portrays their future vision of the Temple Mount with both the Muslim Dome of the Rock and a Jewish temple standing side by side with streams of Jews, Muslims, and Christians all worshiping together on the Temple Mount. As surreal as this vision may seem, there is in fact biblical evidence that the Temple Mount may be shared by both Muslims and Jews. In speaking of the last days Jewish temple, Revelation 11:2 says specifically that the outer court will be given to the Gentiles. Amazingly, Rabbi Glick also sees the Dome of the Rock as potentially becoming a central part of the future Jewish temple.
The house of prayer for all nations, which will be rebuilt, as described by Zechariah and Ezekiel, will be a house of prayer for all nations, and the inner part will be open to all nations. And therefore the Dome of the Rock can definitely be part of it. Now, once again, I'm not talking about building another building.
According to Glick, because Muslims worship one God, their religion is acceptable to Jewish standards, and the present-day Dome of the Rock could not only be incorporated, but could become central to the future Jewish temple.
The idea of the temple is one house for all those who want to say, God is one, His name is one. And this is the dream. The Dome of the Rock has a strong potential to be that because it's at the right location. It represents a nation, a religion faithful in one God. It only has to be one more thing. Agree for religious tolerance. Peace among faithful people.
Imagine if a future Jewish temple actually used the present-day Dome of the Rock as the Holy of Holies. It incorporated it into its temple.
For a born-again, believing Christian who knows the Bible, any spirit that says Jesus is not the Son of God is the spirit of Antichrist.
And so when you go up to the most sacred spot of earth in prophecy, the Temple Mount, you look and right in the middle is this Dome of the Rock and is this mosque and this declaration there saying God has no son. You know, that's just like the work of the enemy.
It is written in the Dome of the Rock, far for God to have a son. It is the same place where Jesus will put his throne there. So Satan is a little bit ahead in action of the church, and he is trying to put his throne instead to prevent Jesus.
The enemy not only does things blatantly like that, but he also is a preemptor. He seeks to stop the work of God before it happens. He tried to kill Moses as a baby, tried to kill Messiah as a baby, tried to wipe out Israel in the Holocaust before the resurrection of Israel, before all the prophecies.
You can see when Satan wants to prevent Jesus from even coming to the world by killing the children. All the time he had plan. He knows what's going to happen for him. So the next plan or the end plan is Jesus is coming and put his throne and will be ruling, and his headquarters will be in Jerusalem and ruling the whole world from Jerusalem. So Satan is doing the same. He wants to put his throne, the Khalifa or the Khilafat, in the same place in order to prevent Jesus from second coming.
So it's just like him to take the place where everything not only happened, but it has to happen, where the throne of God will be, where God's kingdom will be, and set something up right there on top of it saying, hey, you can't do it, because I have it's my mountain. The enemy says, in Ezekiel, the enemy says, I have your high places. You know, but God says, no, that's not going to last.
Another major sign that Jesus warned of with regard to the last days would be the rise of false prophets. Today, throughout the Islamic world, in the nations that surround Israel, there is a dramatic rise in messianic expectation. According to Islamic theology, Muslims are expecting in the last days two primary Messiah figures. The first individual they call the Mahdi. In Iran, they call him the 12th Imam. Now, the Mahdi is essentially a religious, military, political leader that comes in the last days to cause all the world to convert to Islam. The second individual that Muslims are looking for is Isa al-Masih, or Jesus Christ. Muslims teach that when Jesus comes back, he comes back as a Muslim to tell all the people of the world, including Christians, that he never died on the cross, he never claimed to be the Son of God, that Islam is the only true religion, and that all people should convert to Islam and submit to the Mahdi. To discuss the Muslim expectations concerning their two primary Messiah figures, I sat down with two Muslim leaders. The first was Adnan Oktar of Istanbul, and the second was Sheikh Ikrima Saeed Sabri. Sabri is the president of Quranic and Islamic Studies at Al-Quds University in Jerusalem, and he's also the son of the former Grand Mufti of Jerusalem.
المهدي في عقيدتنا أنه رجل صالح سيأتي الله سبحانه وتعالى به في آخر الزمان من أجل أن يقيم العدل خلال مدة معينة، فترة زمنية سيحكم، ثم بعد ذلك يموت، وإنسان عادي. الذي يهمنا طبعا في عقيدتنا هو أنه إن ظهر هذا المهدي نقوم بمناصرته، سيلتقي بالسيد المسيح عليه السلام، أن السيد المسيح في عقيدتنا أنه سيأتي في آخر الزمان، وأنه سيعينه على إقامة العدل في الأرض.
According to Muslim belief, when Jesus returns, he will come back as a Muslim who will deny that he ever claimed divinity or ever claimed to be the Son of God or ever died on a cross.
عندما يأتي سيدنا عيسى عليه السلام طبعا كسر الصليب ليس لذات الصليب، هي عبارة عن قطعة خشبية أو كذا، هو يكسر الصليب إشارة إلى نفي حادثة الصلب، ويكسر الصليب ليعلن أنه ما صلب.
According to the Muslim expectation, together the Mahdi and the Muslim Jesus will cause Islam to become supreme throughout the world, causing most to become Muslims. Likewise, according to the Bible, the Antichrist and the false prophet will force all inhabitants of the world to follow them.
لن يختفي كليا، إنما سيكون هناك غلبة للمسلمين، لأن الإسلام سيقوى. ومن المعلوم أن الدولة القوية عندما تكون موجودة فإنها يكثر أتباعها، وطبعا سيكون عندنا من أهم أسباب انتشار الإسلام وظهور عيسى عليه السلام حسب عقيدتنا، لأن عيسى عليه السلام عندما ينزل سيخاطب النصارى وسيخاطب أتباع الأديان أو الأديان الأخرى أنني أنا عيسى عليه السلام أحكم بشريعة محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم. فبالتالي سيكون هناك عدد من النصارى، عدد كبير سيدخل الإسلام، لأن النبي الذي آمنوا به. أما وضع الجزية بمعنى إلغاء الجزية، سيلغي الجزية لأنه لن يقبل من الناس غير الإسلام، لن يكون هناك أهل ذمة، لأنه يقول لهم أنا أمثل الشيء الذي كنتم تؤمنون به ها أنا بين أيديكم، فأعلن أنه لن يكون هناك أكثر من دين. إذا كنت تريد أن تؤمن بعيسى عليه السلام فأنا عيسى عليه السلام، لن يقبل منه إلا الإسلام.
Another striking reality concerning Islamic expectation of the Mahdi is their belief that only he will be able to mediate peace between Israel and the Palestinian peoples. Throughout the Middle East, there's a yearning and a longing throughout the world for some sort of elusive peace agreement, some type of program that would cause the state of Israel and the Palestinian people to come to some solution to the ongoing conflict. Do you also believe that it will only be through the mediation of the Mahdi that the Israelis and the Palestinians will actually find this peace?
Tabii Mehdi'nin dışında mümkün değil. Yani hiçbir şekilde ne Filistin hükümeti buna yaklaşır, yani Filistin'e yaklaşır, ne de İsrail hükümeti buna yaklaşır. Ancak Mehdi'nin öncülüğünde bu gerçek, bu güzellik oluşacaktır. Hadislerde de öyle geçiyor zaten. Peygamberimiz hadislerinde de o şekilde belirtiliyor.
I also asked Mr. Orktar about his belief that during the time of the Mahdi's reign, sacrifices and offerings will be reinstated on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. His response was very revealing.
Şu an Hristiyanlar da, Museviler de, Müslümanlar da o mescitte ibadet edemiyorlar. Museviler de, Müslümanlar da kurban kesemiyorlar. Ki biz Mehdi devrinde olduğumuza inanıyoruz. Kurban da, sunu da serbest olacak. İlk Mehdi'nin yapacağı icraatlardan birisi budur. Hazreti Süleyman Mescidi'nin yapılışı ve kurbanın ve sununun serbest oluşu ve ibadetlerin rahatça yapılacak hale gelmesidir.
Yet according to Islamic prophecy, the Mahdi will be a Muslim caliph or a global Muslim leader who together with the Muslim Jesus will actually establish his seat of Islamic authority on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem.
طبعا بما أن فلسطين والقدس هي في قلب العالم الإسلامي، إذا لابد أن يكون المسلمون أو المهدي بالتحديد موجودا في هذه المرحلة. وعندما سيأتي المهدي في آخر الزمان لن يقتصر حكمه على بيت المقدس أو على فلسطين، سيكون هو في أغلب دول العالم.
Mr. Oktar even went so far as to claim that during the time of the Mehdi, humans and jinn, or essentially the Muslim version of demons, would freely communicate and interact. Mr. Oktar even went so far as to claim that jinn would play a premier role in causing Islam to prevail throughout the world. You mentioned that during the time of the Mehdi, that the jinn would freely interact with humans and that they would be able to freely communicate. Could you explain that in a little bit more detail?
Evet, Hazreti Süleyman gibi olacaktır Hazreti Mehdi'de. Aynı şekilde cinlerle bağlantısı olacaktır. Mehdi hem cinlerin hem de insanların Mehdisidir. Müslüman olan cinler, Allah'a inanan cinler, İslam'ın dünya hakimiyetinde inananlara yardımcı olacaklar.
Because the Bible teaches that the Antichrist will rule for a period of 7 years, many Christians are surprised to find out that according to Islamic prophecy, the Mehdi will also rule specifically for a period of 7 years.
نعم، وفي هناك أكثر من رواية، لكن الرواية المشهورة هي 7 سنوات.
Many other similarities could be listed, but the point is clear. The expectations of many Muslims throughout the earth concerning the Mehdi and their version of Jesus bears a striking resemblance to what the Bible describes concerning the Antichrist and the false prophet. Though as unusual as much of this information may be to Christians, many Muslims believe that their Mehdi is already here on the earth.
You believe we're living in the time of the Mehdi right now?
Evet, biz Mehdi'nin geldiğine ve faaliyet halinde olduğuna inanıyoruz. İstanbul'da çıktığına inanıyoruz. Çünkü Tevrat'ta o şekilde geçiyor. Yani Musevi kaynaklarda öyle geçiyor. Müslüman kaynaklarda da o şekilde geçiyor. Şii kaynaklarda da aynı şekilde İstanbul'a çıkacağı belirtiliyor. İran'ın önde gelen dini liderleri de aynı şekilde İstanbul'a çıkacağını söylüyorlar. Başka da vakit yok yani.
Simply stated, in light of the many startling ways in which the Islamic Mehdi and the Muslim Jesus align with the biblical expectations concerning the Antichrist and the false prophet, discerning Christians would do well to be aware of the rise of messianic expectation throughout the Islamic world, particularly in light of Jesus' warnings that the last days would be marked by the appearance of false prophets who will arise and mislead many.
Since 2011, after the revolution swept through and forever changed the face of the Middle East, many have been asking, does the so-called Arab Spring have any relevance with regard to biblical prophecy? And I believe it clearly does. When we turn to Daniel chapter 11, we see the detailing of the historical conflict in the 3rd century BC between the northern kingdom of the Seleucids and the southern kingdom of the Ptolemies. And then as we get to the latter sections of that chapter, we're told that this historical conflict would essentially be repeated in the last days. As we consider what is now taking place in the Middle East, we recognize that one of the most profound pieces of the end times puzzle seems to be coming together right now, right before our eyes.
And so you see this, there's this power struggle between what I would consider Turkey and Egypt, and that power struggle, probably for the heart of Islam, is going to be one of the key things in the end times. Israel caught in the middle, and the Antichrist emerging out of the north.
What's north of Israel? Well, some have tried to link it way north to Russia, but I don't think we have to go so far away. We don't need such a large leap of faith. Really, you have right north of Israel now a very vibrant and in many ways virulent enemy in the country of Turkey shaping up, and they're trying to, in many ways, bring together many different nations in union and hatred against Israel.
Daniel is very clear. Antiochus Epiphanes is the picture.
Antiochus Epiphanes being a type or an example, precursor of the Antichrist. Antiochus Epiphanes obviously lived in Antioch and governed the area which is roughly modern-day Turkey, Iraq, and Syria. And so it's that whole northern segment north of Israel.
I believe God's flashing. This is the place where the Antichrist is going to come out of. We'll see a great war between there and Egypt. Egypt will be subdued, and then he'll put his palace, so to speak, right there in Jerusalem.
And so, there can be no question that the so-called Arab Spring has changed the face of the Middle East in such a way that the potential for the soon fulfillment of Daniel 11 is very much coming into focus. This becomes particularly clear when we stop and consider the dramatic changes taking place right now in Egypt and the radical changes that have taken place in recent years north of Israel in both the nations of Turkey and Syria. Let's begin by considering Egypt. Among the various calamities that Isaiah describes as coming upon the Egyptian people in the last days, the first is a dramatic civil war.
You know, one of the passages that has a lot to do with what's currently going on in the Middle East, as we try to unpack it, would be Isaiah 19. You have a reference to Egypt, troubles in Egypt, like a kind of a civil war going on there.
Well, there's great Egyptian revolt in the first verse 1 to 15. In that, there's tremendous chaos, and that's what's happening right now in Egypt. It might get far more intense. I don't know. I can't read into it that clear, but Isaiah 19 is really describing Egypt in turmoil.
So the next verse is, I will get Egyptian again. It is partially fulfilled right now, after the revolution, or what's called Arab Spring in Egypt. So actually it started, Egyptian against Egyptian.
And that creates the context for the great deliverer and for great oppression to come into Egypt, and then to deliver them from the oppression, which we know is Jesus the Messiah.
During my time visiting with the Egyptian church, the nation was experiencing a temporary calm. But it was only weeks after I left, on June 30th, 2013, that nation experienced a second revolution. In what would amount to be the largest protest in human history, over 30 million people took to the streets to demand the ouster of President Mohamed Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood from power. And then in the days since then, the bloodshed began. Since that time, as I've talked with various leaders in the churches in Egypt, the testimony is clear. The civil war spoken of by Isaiah in Isaiah chapter 19 is begun, and it's unfolding right now, right before us. So if Isaiah 19 is beginning to be fulfilled right now in our day, then according to the prophet, what comes next for Egypt? As we look at the subsequent elements of the text, two of the key things that stand out are the drying up of the Nile and the subsequent destruction of the Egyptian economy. In verses 5 through 10, we read that the Nile River will become greatly diminished. It says the river shall be wasted and dried up. And in verse 15, we're told of the great damage this will do to the economy. Neither shall there be work for Egypt, which the head or the tail, branch or bulrush may do.
Then it goes on to an economic disaster. And this is one in which the Nile River, which is the gift of Egypt, said Herodotus, because as that thing flooded every year and spilled over its banks, it left a film of mud, which was like new fertilizer, which was important for an agricultural nation. Egypt is an agricultural nation. And they said, no, we want to go into the new industrial revolution, so we'll build a dam. So they built the dam at Aswan. This dam, which was built over a period of years, finished finally in 1970, was an enormous undertaking. It backed up Lake Nasser 500 miles, huge amount of water. And they said, that will be, we'll use that to run our generators and we'll produce commercial fertilizer. But Lake Nasser is filling up with mud at 100 million tons per year. And the top of it is being blown off because of desiccation of the hot desert winds. So it looks like it will never fill up. So it's filling up with mud, but not filling up with water. Meanwhile, the sardine industry, which was protected by the filling in of the mud at the mouth of the Nile on the Mediterranean Sea, is now the salt waters are backing in, so they lose one of their great exports. They thought they were going to get it out of Lake Nasser, but no, it's now being hit here, and cotton and linen and the other products are explicitly mentioned in Isaiah 19. And this all because of economic disaster. It's one of the ecological failures of our day.
Sadly, the great damage affected upon the Nile through the Aswan Dam project of the 1970s is now threatening to become far worse. Today, the nation of Ethiopia is working on another dam project further downstream. Some present estimates hold that if the dam is completed in Ethiopia, it could lower the Nile by another 20%, effectively destroying the economy of Egypt. The future of the Nile River truly promises to become one of the premier issues for the region in the years ahead. But according to Isaiah's oracle, the worst is yet to come. According to the prophet Isaiah, the capstone of calamities that will befall Egypt is its invasion and defeat by one referred to as a cruel master and a mighty king. This invasion and defeat of Egypt is also described in Daniel chapter 11, where the cruel master is revealed as being none other than the biblical Antichrist.
In Daniel chapter 11, we see oppression coming to Egypt. In Isaiah chapter 19, we see the oppressor coming into Egypt. I believe those are connected with the oppression of Daniel chapter 11.
Daniel 11 gives us clearly the foreshadowing of the kings of the north, the kings of the south, and how that conflict between those two, where Israel gets caught in between those two powers. I think we see that very clearly if you take Daniel 11, 40 through 45. It shows the military victories of the Antichrist. Egypt is clearly overthrown.
But beyond the negative portions of the prophecy that are beginning to be fulfilled in Egypt, there are also very powerful and incredibly positive elements of the prophecy as well. Among these are the growing prayer movement and the revival that is quietly spreading throughout that nation. For at least the past decade, the church in Egypt has regularly seen gatherings of tens of thousands for sustained all-night prayer and worship gatherings. According to Isaiah, as a result of the cry to God that arises from Egypt just before the return of Jesus, that nation will experience a mighty end-time revival.
Talks about Egypt, my people. We tend to think of that word only for the Jews. But God says, no, I'm going to have a kind of a special relationship with Egypt. Then it talks about Assyria, the work of my hands, something I've created by my sovereignty for a specific purpose. But then it ends off and says, Israel, my inheritance. So you've got that issue with the covenant promises, all the covenants mentioned in Romans 9, 3 through 5, etc. So that's a day I'm looking forward to see. We're not yet there, but it's something to pray for.
I think that what's happening in Isaiah chapter 19, I think it's a very critical chapter, is it's intensifying the positive and the negative. The chaos and the sin and the spiritual awakening. I believe it is a prototype of what's happening in the body of Christ across the earth. But Egypt gets an entire chapter. Most nations don't get a whole chapter, but Egypt gets one of the few Gentile nations that get an entire chapter, describing the intensification of the positive and the negative that will escalate into the coming of the Lord. But we look at that from America, and I say what's happening there will happen in like kind around the nations.
So because of the prophecy of Daniel 11, I believe that we should be watching the Middle East, looking for the reemergence of a northern power base similar to the historical Seleucid dynasty, as well as a powerful independent Egyptian power in the south. And I believe that when we look at the Middle East right now, we see one of the most profound pieces of the prophetic puzzle coming together right before our eyes.
When we look at the Bible, especially Ezekiel chapter 38, it talks about some of the countries that are going to be aligned against Israel in the last days. And out of the 8 countries that are mentioned there, 5 of them actually have their borders within what is current-day Turkey. And so biblically, I see Turkey as having a role that will play out against Israel in the end times. This Islamic coalition in the end times that is going to come against Israel, I think Turkey is going to be not only involved at it, but probably at the head of it.
But not only does biblical prophecy seem to point to Turkey as a leading, or perhaps even the leading nation of the coming Antichrist alliance, but many of the changes in that nation in the past decade have very strongly aligned with this possibility.
I think one of the major changes in the Middle East and transformations has been what's been happening in Turkey. And the AKP party, led by Erdogan, has really begun to Islamicize Turkey, and in a profound way, in ways that I think people in the West don't appreciate right now.
Now, the AKP party was very smart when they stepped in to power. They were very quick to say, you know, we're not going for a big Islamic nation. On the contrary, we're hoping to join the European Union, and they kind of proceeded to kind of keep in step with what was happening up until that point, and kept pursuing some sort of admission to the European Union. And yet, over a period of time, they basically started bringing out all the dirty laundry of the military, and pretty soon shamed and embarrassed the military to such state that they were immobilized. And so they basically took out the checks and balances, and then they started to show their true colors.
And so in the process of all of this, any writers of journals or newspapers, magazines, books, anybody that would write anything against Erdogan or against the religious right-wing government, those people would be imprisoned. Turkey has one of the highest rates of imprisonment for journalists more than any country in the world.
The tone, the mood in the country has shifted drastically, and people who live in the country can see it. It's very visible, it's very palpable. The country is definitely headed in an Islamic direction.
What's been happening in Turkey ever since the AKP party took over and begun this restoration, I guess, of what they want, this neo-Ottoman caliphate that they would like to resurrect. They've also reversed what Ataturk did in the 1920s when he abolished the caliphate and began to secularize Turkey. And this has great significance for the Middle East and actually for the world.
What we observed that day in Istanbul was nationalism and the exaltation of one man on a level unlike anything we have ever seen. And it felt like an ominous repeat of history. I couldn't help but see the many similarities between what I was witnessing in Istanbul and the Zeppelin Tribune field in Germany in the 1930s.
He would like to see Turkey become a religious Islamic state. And he would like to see Turkey become the head of the caliphate. For the end times, he would like to see Turkey have a major role in reestablishing the coming of the Mehdi, or the Mahdi, depending on which place you live on, the pronunciation differs. But that's part of his agenda, is to reestablish the Islamic Caliphate here in Turkey, so that will be a stepping stone to bring back the Mahdi.
Turkey's a huge threat because, first of all, because if it's a huge army, it's one of the biggest armies in the Middle East, if not the biggest army in the Middle East. In addition to that, you couple that with the aspirations that they have, which are not always visible, but they have aspirations to revive what they see as this Ottoman Empire that was abolished in the 1920s, and they'd like to see the resurrection of it. So that in the region, that gives them aspirations that they would like to be the dominant player, and that could have potential conflict with Egypt, certainly with Israel, and even with Iran as well.
In the summer of 2013, as the revolutions that have been sweeping across the Middle East finally reached the nation of Turkey, violent protests erupted across that nation. The heart of those protests were in Istanbul, in what's called Taksim Square in Gezi Park. As my team and I arrived in Istanbul, we went directly to the square. What began as a day of relatively peaceful protests eventually developed into a violent conflict between the police and the protesters, with clashes lasting well into the night. As it turned out, this just so happened to be the day that the government had planned and launched a well-orchestrated, complete purge of the square. My team and I were caught right in the middle of it all. Well into the night, the protesters continued their resistance against the police. And although my team and I were caught right in the middle of the water cannons and the percussion grenades and the tear gas and all of the violence, we managed to escape without any injury. And we lived that night to see a profound historical moment, a turning point for the nation of Turkey. What the long-term results of the protests and the deep divisions in Turkey will produce is yet to be seen. But in light of the significant emphasis that biblical prophecy places on that nation, as well as its present trending toward a dangerous combination of Islamism, raw nationalism, and most particularly its growing anti-Israel sentiment, there can be no question that in the days and years ahead, those who are watching and praying should keep a very close eye on the nation of Turkey. Yet while there are indeed many indicators that Turkey may produce the last days King of the North, Antichrist, another very solid possibility is that he could arise from the nearby nations of Syria or Iraq. In considering references to the Antichrist in Daniel chapters 7 and 8, where the Antichrist is described as emerging as a little horn, some have wondered if the emerging radical Islamic Caliphate in Iraq and Syria will someday produce the final dictator. We sat down with a Syrian Christian leader who has seen firsthand the rise of this new Islamic Caliphate. For his security, we had to completely disguise his voice and image.
What is happening now in Syria and other Arab countries, and especially in Syria, Jabhat al-Nusra and radical Muslims, they, in their agenda, to divide Syria into many areas, and each area will be under the radical Islamic control, which means al-Khilafah. And already happened in many cities in Syria. And they let the strong law of Islamic control the people. So it's very, very bad what is happening now, especially if radical Muslims control the Syria and other Arab countries. They are not focusing only in the Middle East. They focus the whole world. They intend to attack Europe and attack America. But now they start in Arab country to make for them basic land to be more strong and to have more support. And the shame thing, Europe and America support them now, and they didn't know maybe in the future, and that will happen, of course. They will attack them in the future. So please wake up.
Perhaps more than any other issue in the region, the emerging caliphate in Iraq and Syria poses the greatest threat to the stability and security of the region. For now, it is essential that the Church remembers to pray for the believers who are now living under this new radical Islamic state of Iraq and Syria. But far beyond any of the signs that we've discussed so far, clearly the most profound and pressing sign of the final hour is the global rise of virulent hatred, even militaristic antagonism toward the Jewish people and the state of Israel. Throughout the prophets, the testimony is clear that in the last days, just before the return of Jesus, this anti-Semitism would rise throughout the nations, eventually leading to the nations actually gathering together against the nation of Israel and the city of Jerusalem.
Now, the prophet Zechariah said that one day that Jerusalem itself would become a burdensome stone to the nations, and the nations in this region and perhaps others around the world would gather against Jerusalem. And so you could say that history's final chapter will be written here in the city of Jerusalem.
And what they want to do is they want to exterminate the Jewish people, drive them into the sea, and take over the full control of Jerusalem.
And especially in the last few years, that the city of Jerusalem has become the target for many groups in this region who mean Israel and Jerusalem ill, and they want to capture Jerusalem to make it part of this capital of a caliphate, an Islamic caliphate that would one day rule the world.
The constellation of nations moving against Israel. You know, barely 40, 50 years ago, we couldn't believe that Iran would have turned against Israel, or that Sudan would have turned against Israel, because these were nations with good relationships with the Jewish state. But that has changed.
In what's called the Arab Spring, which has really seemed to have become the Islamic winter, it seems as if the vitriol by the surrounding nations against Israel and against the Jewish people has risen exponentially. And that's been accompanied by a rise of anti-Semitism around the world. You see anecdotally here in Jerusalem that many French Jews have bought places here in Jerusalem as a safe haven because they feel one day that perhaps France or places in Europe will be too dangerous for Jewish people.
We're living in the first generation in human history where we have signposts at the end of the age, like the gospel going to every tribe and tongue, but we again have a Jewish political state that is threatened on all sides by global anti-Semitism.
So we see in modern history something that could not have been said quite in the same way in centuries past. Israel is now surrounded by nations that are mentioned specifically in Ezekiel 38, Psalm 83, and other places, and surrounded not only by those specific nations, but those nations are speaking vehemently with reference to the destruction of Israel, the extermination of the Jew. There's a hatred toward what Daniel calls the Holy Covenant that is being manifested in our day in an unparalleled way. If the church doesn't see this and recognize it, it's only because we've got our heads stuck in the sand. It's the clear biblical testimony, and modern history is thundering it out for us to pay attention.
We go back and we say, wow, the Germans were so blind in the late 30s, couldn't they see it coming? But right now, what's being said openly, particularly in the Middle East, but even all over the earth, is far more virulent, far more aggressive than what was ever said publicly in Nazi Germany.
From the West Coast, 5, 6, 7, 8, Israel's an apartheid state! To the East,
stop the genocide!
Anti-Israel protests are gaining momentum and getting nasty.
So despite the claims of many even within the church who say that the Lord is done with the land and the people of Israel, the fact of the matter is it's easy to see that if that's true, Satan clearly has not received the memo. What's clear is that right now the rage of Satan continues to be vented directly against that people and that specific piece of land.
The enemy's been trying to wipe out the Jewish people with all hell for 2,000 years. I mean, crazily, supernatural. I mean, crazy. Hitler, I mean, just a obsession that makes no sense except supernaturally. That only proves God, because if the enemy is trying to wipe out this particular people, if he's trying to fight over this particular land, what it tells you is God has something for this particular people, and God has something for this particular land, and it's marking the spot, and here, hey guys, it's going to happen here. So by default, he ends up bearing witness to God and the purposes of God.
Sadly, the trend toward hatred of the Jew and radical anti-Israel sentiment is now spreading even in the Christian church.
One of the great tragedies happening in the body of Christ, although I have a lot of friends that are promoting, I call this a tragedy, and it's the anti-Semitism that is on the back end of amillennialism. And I have a lot of good friends that promote amillennialism, which is more of the end-time prophecies, or most of them are spiritualized, and the approach, they're not literal. And though they love Jesus and are real faithful preachers of the Bible, this is a popular trend. But one of the real downsides of that is this kind of negative attitude towards Israel, rather than understanding Israel in God's opinion. I mean, Israel's weak and broken just like the Gentiles are. But it's the election of God that is the issue that's at stake here.
Today, the controversy and the contention is mounting in an unprecedented way. And we could explain it in geopolitical terms, we could explain it in historical terms, and still miss the underlying reason. And the underlying reason why there's so much controversy about the city of Jerusalem today is because God made covenant about His Son ruling and reigning from a specific piece of land on a specific hill at an appointed time. And as we draw closer to that appointed time, the powers and principalities and rulers of the air will get more urgent in their rage, their resistance, their opposition, and their contention, and they will use men like puppets to effect and to orchestrate their plans and purposes.
As today's ideological and political trends continue to prepare the world for the final thrust against Jerusalem and the Jewish people, the scriptures are clear that in the day of judgment, the Lord will execute vengeance against both individuals and nations who mistreated Israel and the Jewish people in the last days.
Why God would, in that final day of the Lord, in the end of history, as we think of it, bring judgment because the way the nations have treated Israel and because they have divided up the land.
One of the most frequently spoken of matters in the prophetic scripture is this issue of the Lord bringing the nations together at the day of the Lord to enter into judgment with them for how they mishandled and mistreated his covenant people of the apple of his eye. We see this in Joel 3, we see it in Ezekiel 38 and 39. We see it in Zechariah 14, a post-exile prophet speaking about destruction to come to Jerusalem and then judgment being executed against the kings of the earth for how they mishandled this people.
God consistently said, at the end of the age, I judge on behalf of Israel. In other words, something has happened in the earth that caused the nations to respond to Israel in such a way that God can judge all the nations on the one question of what did they do? How did they respond to the issue of Israel? Obviously, the ultimate issue is how each man responds to Jesus, but something is coming that creates a context where Jesus says our response to the Jew, not just theologically, but practically, because he judges, did you help them? Did you protect them? Did you give them shelter? Did you give them food? Did you give them clothing? Something happens on the earth that Jesus can measure our obedience and our love of him with our stewardship or our care for them. And shockingly, Jesus equates our treatment of them with our treatment of him.
While in Jerusalem, I met with Rabbi Yeshayahu HaKohen Hollander. Rabbi Hollander is the foreign minister of the nascent, reorganized Sanhedrin. I asked Rabbi Hollander, what can Christians do to stand with the Jewish people in light of the rising tide of global anti-Semitism?
If we stick to the truth and say these are the facts, if you talk about this, compare it with ABC, and stick to the truth, emphasize the truth, correct proportionality, and I think as people are presented with the truth and the facts, most people, and most situations, or I mean, it would even go further. All people in most situations prefer the truth. That doesn't mean they know the truth. And they have to be presented with the truth. This is very important.
So in conclusion, it's clear that many of the signs are aligning and setting up for what the Bible calls the last days. But it's also true that the majority throughout the church today are not living with that eschatological urgency of the hour. They're not living with the missionary zeal of the early church. But the Lord is faithful, and he will awaken and prepare his people.
Is the church ready? No. Is the Lord intimidated? No. He's going to prepare an equally yoked bride for his son. And we're going to be ready. He's going to finish what he started. Is there going to be growth pains? Is there going to be a big learning curve? Yes. But that's why we're praying. We're asking God to pour out his Spirit on every tribe, tongue, and nation, that the church would awaken into what she's called to do and who she's called to be.
This time is very critical. We can say we are in the end of a story. We are the end of days. And every voice is over all the world saying, Jesus is coming, be ready. He is coming, wake up. Middle East, West America. Jesus is coming. What are you doing? What is your job? You have to do work, God's will for our mighty Father. He is coming.
So while the earliest Christians, the most radical generation, that generation of Christians which turned the world upside down in just one generation, while they were clearly thoroughly apocalyptic in their outlook, diligently studying the prophets to understand the signs of the times, for them the issue of the end times was far from just theoretical. For them the issue of the end times was thoroughly applicational. It guided how they lived both individually and as a community. And so also with the modern church. In light of the present hour, in light of the storm clouds that are gathering, as the climax of human history falls on us, we have to be asking ourselves this question: how should we be living in light of the approaching hour?